Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for the monthly NCORE webinar series. NCORE webinars are the production of the Southwest Center for Human Relations Studies at the University of Oklahoma, Norman campus. I'm Corey Davidson, Program Assistant for NCORE, and I'm delighted to be your host today. Please use the chat to tell us where you're joining us from. For those of you joining us for the first time, NCORE offers 2 webinars per month on the first and last Wednesday. This is the last webinar for the fall. More webinars will be announced soon. Please visit our website for webinars on demand. Just a reminder that the call for proposals for NCORE 2022 is now open, and we'd like you to join us in Portland, Oregon, May 31st through June 4th, 2022. College students across the country can apply for scholarships. Our presenter today is Dr. Courtney Gay. Dr. Gay serves as the Assistant Athletic Director for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the University of Georgia. She is responsible for developing and implementing diversity, equity, and inclusion strategies for department performance in diversity and inclusive excellence. Before beginning her tenure at UGA, Dr. Gay gained community affairs and player development experience in roles with the Atlanta Braves, Fort Worth Flyers, and the National Football League. A native of Houston, Texas, Dr. Gay earned a Bachelor's of Journalism and a Bachelor's of Arts from the University of Missouri, a Master's of Science in Kinesiology with a focus on sports management from Texas A&M University, and a doctorate in counseling and student personal services from the University of Georgia. As a reminder that ACL and live captioning are available for this broadcast. And if you would please post any questions in our Q&A box. Please welcome Dr. Gay.
Thank you so much. I appreciate everyone for being here. I'm really excited to have the opportunity to discuss Beyond the Game, engaging student athletes around social justice issues. As our hosts have mentioned, if you have any questions, I look forward to taking those at the end. And so without further ado, we will go ahead and get started. All right, so first, I would just like to offer a land of acknowledgement. This land on which I inhabit here in Athens, Georgia, is physically situated in the original ancestral homelands of the Cherokee and Creek. And we pay homage and respect to Cherokee and Creek peoples of past, present, and future, and their continuing presence in the homeland and throughout the historical diaspora. I also want to offer a disclaimer. This presentation is based upon research that I've conducted. The opinions expressed in this presentation do not reflect the views or opinions of the University of Georgia Athletic Association, the University of Georgia, or the Board of Regents of the University System of Georgia. So at first, I wanted to offer a little bit as any good researcher does, to talk a little bit about my positionality and how I came to this work. So I have worked in sports for the entirety of my career. After serving as a graduate assistant in the athletic department at Texas A&M University, I spent the next 7 years working in professional sports roles with the NFL, the NBA, G League, and Major League Baseball, before coming back to higher ed and college athletics at the University of Georgia, where I've had a variety of roles in athletic and academic student services before transitioning to my current role as the Assistant AD for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. And so while this is the first opportunity where, DEI work has been my main role, it certainly it's something that I've been engaged in throughout my whole career, and it's always been a passion of mine, particularly in regards to race. And, throughout my time working in athletics, I've always been interested in the intersection of sport and social justice. It's always been an area of passion and interest of mine. And so as we know, sport has a cultural influence in society. It provides the opportunity to really be utilized as a platform to affect social change. And historically, many professional athletes have utilized their platform to speak out on social issues, whether it was the Olympians or Muhammad Ali speaking out against the war, tennis pro Billie Jean King, and of course, Colin Kaepernick who, began nailing in the 2016 NFL football season, which sparked both controversy and a lot of debate. So this is not a new phenomenon, but I think we have definitely come to see the intersection of sport and social justice really opened up to new heights in recent years. And so I'll talk a little bit about that, but that really had a lot to do with how I came to this work. The other piece is in 2015, there were racial incidents that occurred at the University of Missouri. And that really, truly impacted me personally because I received my undergraduate degree at the University of Missouri, and I'm a proud alum who's always been very engaged with the institution. As a student affairs practitioner working with student athletes, and it really shifted my focus in wanting to be engaged in DEI work in athletics. And as a scholar, at the time, I was engaged in my doctoral coursework, and I was working towards determining what would be the focus of my dissertation. So the events that happened at the University of Missouri really, like I said, it was really sort of all my worlds colliding together and really brought all these things to the forefront for me from a personal, professional, and scholastic effort. And so I say this to say these are two tweets that were sent out just to refresh everyone's memory. So the University of Missouri had been experiencing some racial issues on campus. One of the student leaders had been harassed. A group of students of color had been harassed while practicing for a homecoming event. And then they formed a group called Concerned Student 1950. This was paying homage to the first year that African Americans attended the university. And so this group of students had different protests on campus, and it reached a point where Jonathan Butler, a graduate student, was frustrated. The discussions with both the system president and the campus chancellor had not been going well. The students had listed out some demands and things. There had been no progress. And so the graduate student had mentioned or decided that he was going to go on strike. And so student athletes from the University of Missouri football team said that in support of Mr. Butler's hunger strike, and really in support of what was going on campus, and the concerns that had been raised by Concerned Student 1950, that they would not be engaged in any football activities until the president had resigned. And so this is also, on November 7th of 2015, they released this. The following day, their head coach released this message showing the entire football team standing in solidarity with the students that had initiated this protest. And so that really, at that time, it really changed the trajectory of what I wanted to do for my dissertation. As I had watched, activism had really started to reach new heights, and I'd watched student athletes and students in general become more engaged. I'd had a lot of questions, but when I saw this, it really hit home for me, both because it was the institution at which I had attended and was engaged with, but also thinking about it from a practitioner and scholar perspective of, what care are we taking with these students? Who's helping them navigate this? What does this look like for athletic practitioners and other student affairs practitioners working within athletics? And so I really wanted to embark upon this project to really start to examine this issue of student athletes and their engagement around social justice issues. So the statement of the problem, again, in this renewed college student activism around social justice, in this renewed climate, this was a unique opportunity to really enhance the learning and development of student athletes and engage them beyond the athletic realm. Many athletic departments, hadn't chosen to leverage this opportunity. That's something that I'll discuss shortly. Others had failed to address social justice issues and focused on avoiding controversy or discouraging student athletes from engaging. And then some athletic administrators, did embrace their athletes' engagement around social justice issues, and they really did see it as an opportunity for their students' learning and development, and really they took the effort to integrate social justice education into their leadership and service programs. So amidst this climate, I really saw, not only was there a renewed sense of student activism and student athlete engagement, but also there was a difference of how across different athletic departments, how it was approached. And so that really set the stage for this work. So the questions that I sought to research were, this was an instrumental case study, and it was really to explore the environmental and organizational conditions that enabled an NCAA Division I athletic department to create an educational leadership program aimed at engaging student athletes around racial justice, diversity, and inclusion issues. And so the key aspects of what I really sought to know through this work was, what are the environmental conditions and organizational characteristics that really foster student athlete engagement around social justice? And what do student athletes learn as a result of engaging around these social justice issues? So I framed the work with a literature review, and I just kind of wanted to walk through some of the main components of that to really set the stage and provide better context for the work. So first is student activism in higher education. You know, student activism has truly had a central role in campus life since the inception of institutions of higher education, whether it was to improve campus conditions, or such as accommodations or meals, or institutional policies and procedures that students felt were unjust. And so in the 20th century, the focus of student activism really moved beyond local campus issues towards pressing societal issues. So for example, in the 1930s, around the Great Depression, anti-war demonstrations. And then of course in the 60s, civil rights movement, anti-Vietnam demonstrations. In the 70s, women's rights. In the 1980s, LGBTQIA rights. And also a turn towards international issues such as apartheid in South Africa. And then the 90s was really where we saw a lot of identity-based activism and really focusing on the experience of students, what they were having in their campus communities. So there was really, this shift. And so, in the 60s, it was really about rights. In the 21st century, it really became more about equality of opportunity. So if we fast forward to 2011, there was the Occupy Wall Street movement that began in New York. And that really, we saw students engaging across multiple campuses and bringing those Occupy movements to their campuses. Also, the US Department of Civil Rights issued the Dear Colleague letter, and which really spelled out how sexual assault was a violation of Title IX procedures. And so this was a new interpretation that really started off a wider ranging discussion around sexual assault. We saw students engaging around when DACA was passed and discussions about undocumented students. In 2012, the killing of Trayvon Martin began the Black Lives Matter movement to be continued, and even more once when Michael Brown was murdered in Ferguson, Missouri in 2014. And then in 2015, in the fall, as I mentioned, the Mizzou situation, but there was also an incident at Yale University where a residence hall director sent a controversial response about a sensitivity around Halloween costumes. And so those incidents at Yale and at Mizzou really, truly kind of really captured the imagination of a lot of student activists across campuses. And they really saw the platform that they had as students to utilize to make their voices heard. And so it really ushered in a new era of student activism that had really been building for several years. And so, as I mentioned, in talking about these contemporary moments of student activism, the administrative response to student activism really varied. So since the incidents at Kent State and Jackson State in the 1970s, institutions have been really cautious about using force against students around incidents. But, there were arrests of student protesters. There were times when student protesters at campuses have been had conduct violations. There were pepper sprayed. Some administrators lost their jobs, but then there were others too that really took these opportunities as a true learning moment and wanted to really lean in to make sure that they heard their voices of their students and really make it like a collaborative learning environment. So for example, I recall at Towson University, the students there had presented a list of demands. And so the president invited the student into their office and sat with the students, and there was a discussion, and they went through the demands, and it was close to midnight in that evening where they came to an agreement on those demands. At Emory University, it was sort of a similar discussion where really administration really leaned into the students and really sought to, hear their concerns, and there was a task force that was formed. So like I said, there's really been a myriad of responses that administrators at various campuses and the ways that they've reacted to student activism. And then I talked about the landscape of Division I collegiate athletics. So, talking about, the way that Division I is aligned at this moment. You have the Power 5 conferences. If you're following and you're a sports fan, you've seen, that with the University of Oklahoma and the University of Texas, soon to depart for the Southeastern Conference, similar to the way when Texas A&M and the University of Missouri joined the conference, it really has touched off a more realignment of the conferences. So, but those Power 5s, there's sort of set up where there's the haves and have-nots, and whether that's in regards to resources, exposures. But from between 2004 and 2015, we've seen media rights, and it's continued to grow, but because of largely in part to media rights, over 100% growth in revenue in collegiate athletics, but also 128.7% growth in spending. And this really has a lot to do with a variety of factors, ranging from the rising cost of higher education, so the rising cost of supporting student athletes, especially in regards to their educational costs and scholarships, housing and meeting those needs. But also, there is this competitive environment in collegiate athletics now where, everyone wants to make sure that they're providing the absolute best things for their student athletes, particularly when you look at facilities. So always, what new facilities do you have? What things can you do to make sure that you're really being competitive and really attracting the best student athletes to your campus, which of course raises the profile of the institution as a whole. And I also discussed some of the disparities between students of color and other marginalized populations competing in student athletics, and whether it's graduation rates or representation in sports beyond football and men's and women's basketball, the inclusion of LGBTQIA student athletes. So these are all really contemporary issues that really shape the current landscape of Division I collegiate athletics. So in regards to student athlete activism, much like student activism in general, student athletes have always joined their non-student athlete peers in advocating for causes that they believe in. So looking back, when Brown versus the Board of Education was passed in 1954, prior to that, many student athletes of color or other marginalized groups didn't have access to compete at institutions of higher education. But after the passage of that, there were student athletes that were more so able to play in the North and the West, but they still faced discrimination, whether it was from housing or traveling, because due to segregation laws in the South, there were still a lot of limitations on where student athletes could compete. So the 60s was really aligned with the civil rights movement. Student athletes were protesting, as more institutions complied with Brown and there was more access, but there were challenges, whether it was the campus climate or the isolation faced by athletes of color in these communities, the climate of the athletic department, not having staff that looked like them, that could relate to them or were looking after them. Oftentimes, their educational achievement wasn't prioritized. And there are other things such as medical treatment, even the way that they were utilized on the field was often they were faced a lot of discriminatory practices. So a lot of student athlete activism in the 60s was around these issues. In 1967, Dr. Harry Edwards, who was a very large pioneer in, when we talk about the intersection of sport and social justice, he helped athletes protest at San Jose State University. It was actually the first game to be canceled due to protests. And so after the players for San Jose State and also at the University of Texas at El Paso planned to boycott the game based on the experiences that what student athletes were experiencing and facing and the challenges. In the 60s and 70s, in the Western Athletic Conference in particular, a lot of athletes protested, when the teams would play Brigham Young University, because at the time, the Mormon Church had policies where leadership, they did not allow people of color to be in positions of leadership. And so oftentimes athletes competing in the Western Athletic Conference, didn't want to compete when the teams engaged against BYU. So this was also, there was a Syracuse 9 in 1970, football players who came together to protest the conditions of athletes of color at the institution. And the 70s was marked by, a lot of protests for women about how are women being included in athletics. And so similar to what we discussed in regards to student activism and the response to what the greater societal issues, has been the same situation with student athlete activism. Also, a lot of student athlete activism has been around the experience of student athletes. So whether it's student athletes' rights like Grambling University or at Northwestern, where there was discussions around unionizing, that's also been something that student athletes have engaged around their experience as specific to student athletes. And then of course, identity-based activism. So whether it's race, gender, the LGBTQ community, I mentioned sexual assault, any of those issues are all things that student athletes have engaged in activism around. I also discussed the outcomes of student engagement in social justice education and activism, as that's also a pressing conversation. And it's recognizing that, for students to engage around activism is really an opportunity for self-discovery, enhanced civic learning, and collaboration with faculty and staff. And for student athletes, it really presents an opportunity for engagement beyond the athletic realm. There's also challenges for engaging in activism, be it the time commitment, the physical, psychological, and personal costs of activism for students can also be significant. So really examined all of those issues in that section. And lastly, just talking about a little bit of campus ecology. So referencing Bronfenbrenner and how, the microsystems, mesosystems, exosystems, and macrosystems of an individual really create that, phenomenon of environmental press and how they all impact one another. And then Strange and Banning's theory, where the four main environmental components, so whether we're talking about the physical component, the aggregate, the organizational or constructed, really impact educational environments, the community, the engagement and safety and inclusion of those in the campus environment. So really thinking about how, the relationship between the campus environment and engagement around activism. So for methodology for the study, I utilized a constructivist paradigm, meaning that there are multiple truths and the social reality is socially constructed. I selected this as an instrumental case study design utilizing the scholarship of Stake. Instrumental case studies are opportunities where, really studying a specific case can be utilized as a means of exploring a larger issue or phenomenon. So the case that I chose was at Game Changer University, which is a public research land grant institution in the upper Midwest of the US. And it's an institution as an NCAA Division I member. And so the case was the Take the Lead program, which is an educational leadership program facilitated in partnership with a nonprofit group called the Sport Leadership Group. So this case really provided the opportunity with this Take the Lead program. It was framed as an educational leadership program, but there were really various components of it that included, were really about racial justice and social justice issues. So, learning about, talking about identity and privilege and unconscious bias and microaggressions, how to have challenging conversations. These were some of the elements of the program that were put in place at GCU. And so I really wanted to, as I mentioned with my research questions, dig into how was this program able to be formed at this institution and what were the outcomes for students. So the theoretical framework for this was the multi-level model of social change in intercollegiate sport by Melton. And so really in this model, as you can see here, it identifies various factors which are described as antecedents that it can influence the desired transformative outcomes at the micro, meso, and macro level. of intercollegiate sports organizations. For example, let's take a look at the micro level. So a student athlete, a perspective altering experience could be building a friendship with a teammate whose social identities are different from their own. But the teammate's conversation can provide both both students with an opportunity to reflect on their social privileges, which is one of the outcomes shown in the model. Institutionalized practices are a macro level antecedent that could result in greater diversity within sport. So for example, an athletic department that is committed to considering a diverse slate of candidates when seeking to fill vacancies is illustrative of this macro level antecedent and outcome. So that was really what I utilized as a theoretical framework for this study. So in regards to data collection, first was observation. So I spent about a week on campus at GCU, and I really took the opportunity to, I mentioned in the campus ecology and really talking about the different aspects of that, but just really truly observing, the physical environment of the campus, observing, going in different buildings, I took an informal tour, I took a formal tour, really observing the way that people engaged on the campus, and then spending time in the GCU athletic office as well. Really had the opportunity to meet a lot of staff. I had the opportunity to observe how they engaged with the student athletes. So I really got a feel for the culture and the climate of GCU, both as an institution as well as from an athletic standpoint. I conducted individual interviews. And so I did face-to-face semi-structured interviews with 3 individuals who were engaged in the administration of the Take the Lead program. And I really wanted to get their experience of the university and the athletic environment and really observe their outcomes I wanted to understand their perspective on the outcomes of the students' participation in this program. And then I conducted a focus group with 8 student athletes to gain their perspective as well on their experience at GCU, their experience with Take the Lead and what those learning outcomes. And then document review. So I took the opportunity, I collected all types of documents ranging from when I met with the staff at GCU, they provided me with meeting notes from, the first time that, they met with the organization to really start planning the Take the Lead program. And really kind of seeing how the plan for the program really grew. So I had the opportunity of that, looking at different, publications that the nonprofit organization put together. Also, really did a lot of research around some of the messaging around the program when it was announced in this collaboration that came from athletics. And then also wanted to take a look at the campus as well. I analyzed everything from press releases to the president of the institution wrote frequent, had frequent correspondence with the campus community. And I noticed that oftentimes a lot of it had to do with issues related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I really took a look at those as well. So just a lot of documents, that really helped to provide additional context from an athletic standpoint and from an institutional standpoint. So this is a look at the interview participants from the staff perspective. So as I mentioned, I interviewed 3 staff members in the GCU Athletic Student Services Department, as well as the Director of Education for the Sports Leadership Group, which was the group that was a nonprofit organization that GCU partnered with to facilitate the Take the Lead program. And these are the profiles of the student athletes that I conducted the focus group with. So the majority were from either the football team or the track and field team. That is one thing when, discussing, coming to the end of the work, I did wonder, had my results been a little different if we had more of a cross section of the student athletes from different teams, but these were the student athletes who chose to engage in the focus group, and we still had a very rich conversation. And then data analysis. So I utilized, I coded my field notes and transcripts and utilized the 3-cycle coding method that Saldana has suggested. So in the first cycle, I used initial coding. I coded the field notes and the individual interview and focus group transcripts. I utilized pattern coding for the second cycle. And then during the final cycle, I consolidated the categories into themes that allowed me to address the research questions that framed the inquiry. And as I mentioned, of all those documents, so I put together a document review protocol. And so that protocol, as I read through each document, it provided me the opportunity to I recorded the identifying details, such as the title, the author, the format of the document, whether it's a press release, a news release, whether it was an article, program content, meeting notes, etc. Once I'd done that, then I made note of key messages and words utilized in the document as I examined the content. And then I read each document twice, recording my initial thoughts and reactions to the material, and really made sure that I had in-depth notations regarding the content of the second reading. And so for the rigor of the study, I employed methodological triangulation by utilizing the 3 different data collection methods that I discussed. And then also member checking. So after recording each of the individual interviews, I provided each participant with a copy of the transcript to review, as well as the focus group. I did a preliminary synopsis of that as well for the study participants to have the opportunity to elicit their feedback. And then congruence. So, it's important that in order to achieve congruency, that researchers take the opportunity to make sure that all the elements of the project are aligned. And so, for instance, the constructivist paradigm that I employed for the study was congruent with my choice to utilize case study, because it was a way of exploring the multiple perspectives of the data and the participants. And then I also utilized, like I mentioned, multiple data collection methods. So that really helped me to capture the full spectrum of all the perspectives. And then lastly, reflexivity. I talked a lot about at the beginning about my perspective and how I came to this work. In this qualitative work, it's really important to, continue to be aware of the perspective that I'm bringing to the research process and the connection to the study participants. So I kept a journal throughout the research process and throughout my engagement in the study in order to assist me in this process. And I also considered my positionality in a detailed section in the work. So now to the fun part. What were the findings of this work? So as I mentioned, my research questions were, what are the environmental conditions and organizational characteristics that foster student-athlete engagement around social justice issues? So I found as a total of 7 different themes. So in regards to the environmental conditions, it was contextual elements, alignment with institutional and athletic department values and culture. And then along with my second research question, what did the student athletes learn as a result in their engagement around social justice issues? It was really skill development, understanding the power of the student athlete platform, cultural competence, and being equipped to engage in critical conversations. And the last theme was building community. So let's dig into these a little bit. So first and foremost, the contextual elements. So this is from one of the staff members, Michael. And basically the main aspect of this quote is really talking about how, college campuses are truly a microcosm of what society is. And so Michael was really speaking to what was happening at GCU. So in addition to what was going on nationally, again, during the time this was going on, it was the 2008 presidential election. And so this was our 2012 presidential election, was taking place. And so, or 2016, 2016 presidential election that was taking place. So this was happening, and it was a very heated presidential election. Also, as I mentioned, it was around the time where, Colin Kaepernick had began his protests. And so this was something that was also taking place, as well as there were some unique things happening in the state in which GCU was located, that there was an environmental issue that was taking place, and it was really had a lot of racial undertones and things that were related. And so this really impacted the student body as a whole and was a continuous discussion point as well, the issues that were taking place in the state. And so as Michael mentioned, the conditions for the Take the Lead program are really right, both what was happening from a societal standpoint and in context at the institution. And secondly, align with the institutional and athletic department values and cultures. So I really felt, one of the reasons why this program was able to come to be was because of this alignment. So first, as far as diversity and inclusion goes, the institution was really committed to diversity and inclusion. I really felt, especially in looking at the documents and just really having the opportunity to speak with some of the staff, both at the institution and athletics, it really seemed to be a place, certainly not perfect, but where the institution really made it a real effort to not only espouse a commitment to diversity and inclusion, but also to live that out in its practice every day. Also, what was one thing that was unique about GCU is they had a very sizable international student population. And so, oftentimes in discussions about diversity, equity, and inclusion, we do focus on race or, sometimes even, Black and white, but this really opened up conversations about race beyond Black and white, which I felt was like a really unique thing at that institution. And also the athletic department had created a multicultural student athlete organization. So this is something that they had going for at least 20 years, which I thought was really remarkable and something that, they continued to pour a lot of resources into it. At the time where I was working, on this project, they had actually started to revamp the program because they were really conscious of, is this effective? We don't want it to just be a box check. We want to make sure it's something that's really helping our student athletes and helping them feel supported. And so, given what was happening, as I mentioned, from a societal standpoint on campus and in the state, they really were making an effort to tailor this program to meet the needs of the student right where they were in the context of this moment. Secondly, a willingness to really truly address social justice issues and take actionable steps to affect change. So, in doing my research and again, having the opportunity to engage and learn about the GCU, the institution and the athletic department both had a long history of leadership around social justice issues. So like at the institution, for example, it was one of the first institutions in the country to admit women. Also one of the first institutions in the country to have women in leadership roles and people of color in leadership roles. The same with the athletic department. Some of their athletic pioneers were not only the first people at that campus to engage people of color to play collegiate athletics, but some of the first in the country. And so, the athletic department, again, was really committed, from way back when to really, being trailblazers in that instance. And then I think the passion of the institutional and athletic department leadership. As I mentioned, the document piece, that really stood out to me, how, oftentimes, it's common for campus leaders to send out messages to the campus. But I was really struck by, at this institution, how the campus leadership, so many of them were really directly and not in a very direct way talked about, social issues. And then also the athletic department leadership. We'll talk a little bit more about that later in the findings, but they're really committed to making sure that this was an impactful program, that Take the Lead wasn't something that they just did for the student athletes, but they truly were committed to advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion and social justice and racial justice as much as possible, and making sure it was truly something that was going to elicit change and growth for the student athletes. And the other theme was innovation. So again, kind of looking at the institution and the athletic department, really tried to be innovative in their approach. So as I mentioned, it was truly a value of GCU, but it was something that, when I was doing my tours and observations, it's common for institutions to have banners with a theme, but at this institution, it was really about those goals of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and making sure this was a space where everybody belonged. And I felt like you saw that messaging, whether it was banners in buildings, it was very prominent in the majority of campus facilities. And so I think even just having that visual was really important. the institution was one of the first to have an anti-bias unit in their campus police force and really served as a model for other institutions. And then I mentioned how the athletic department, really revamped the student athlete multicultural organization. They were, like I said, they were in the midst of that when I was there, but they had done it several times before, just to recognize that, almost as I was discussing about how the focus of student activism have changed, the needs of students have changed. And so they always wanted to make sure that it was aligned with that. And then the Take the Lead program in and of itself was innovative. So I felt that the institution and the athletic department were truly, they really felt innovation was a big part of their approach, and they were always looking for ways to grow in this area. And then a commitment to ongoing student learning and development. So this is Demetrius, was the person from the nonprofit, and it was like, I might be biased here, but was really impressed with the athletic leadership and making sure that this program had become part of the fabric of the academic athletic experience, whether it was something that was auxiliary. And so I mentioned, reading through the plans, and when I was talking with the staff, the first year of the program, they started with smaller groups and tried to kind of integrate it into other programs. But the true vision for the program was to make sure that from the moment the student came to campus as a freshman to when they left as a senior, they had an opportunity to have a really robust leadership experience that really gave them an opportunity to dive deeply into, social justice issues. And that was something that was really important to them. So really looking at the longevity of the program, how do they grow the program? How do they make it something that is part of the student's experience for all of the time, that they're competing? And then the student learning outcomes. So the first was the skill development, and talking with the students, and, through the study, I really recognized that they were developing some key skills. So the first was reflection. Steve talked about how, in high school, he didn't really have the opportunity to talk about many of the topics that they talked about and Take the Lead. So, in doing social justice work, it's so important that people have the opportunity to reflect. And it's an ongoing process, but I think that's often the place to start. And so I think that Steve voiced here, as others did well in my conversations, that they really felt that this program enabled them the opportunity to build this reflective skill. The other was perspective taking. So as Beyonce, another participant, and this, I did allow the students, they all picked their own pseudonyms, all the participants, but she mentioned that she really felt like, programs like Take the Lead are really necessary because, I think part of it was starting the conversation, and especially with people that aren't familiar with having this conversation. And so she talked a lot about how, her experience with people really, this was eye-opening for students, and having these opportunity and space to really have conversations and have a different perspective. So talking about how, some of the African-American student athletes could see things from their perspective, and white student athletes. So really creating this pathway of understanding. I will always remember, her discussing that these different opportunities and pathways for understanding that hadn't been present before, and, really feeling, appreciative that the athletic department had provided this opportunity for the student athletes, and really her feeling like not only with her own teammates, but other student athletes really seeing the growth that came from this. But it really started with just that ability to, look at things from somebody else's perspective, and take a look at things from their shoes. And then empathy. This is a key skill set that we talk a lot about when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So, there was an exercise that was part of the training. And so Lonzo was talking about it. And I remember he was saying this was probably one of the most impactful things he had ever done. He said that, so the facilitator was, reading a list of things and said, if this applies to you, raise your hand. And, I think really for him, just having the opportunity to see both areas of commonality and different layers of people's experiences were really important. And so I think, again, having that empathy for things that people may be going through that you weren't aware of, and also having the opportunity to recognize that others are going through things as well, I think was really important. And then understanding the power of the student athlete platform. So we talked a lot about this, both with the students and also with the staff, but I'll start with the students since we're talking about the learning outcomes for them. But, as Lonzo talked about, part of this was learning, for the student athletes, giving them the opportunity to really talk about how can they use their sport as a stepping stool to something greater. How can they use their platform to be a better example? Lonzo was really, particularly of all the student athletes, really, really committed to community engagement and wanting to, being part of this program for him really helped him see the ways that he could utilize his athletic platform to be a difference maker. And so that was important to him. I also think that, in talking with the staff and creating this program, while the direct goal, I recall one of the participants saying, our goal is not for people to be activists. If that happens, that's fine. But we really want them to recognize the power of their voice and the power of their platform. And so I think that was really, when talking with the student athletes, and, I remember, sitting with Lonzo in the group, and I think that this was something that I felt like that objective was really accomplished through this program, that the student athletes really did recognize the power of their voice and their platform and how they could really utilize it to affect change in whichever area that they felt called to do. And then also cultural competence. So, one thing, as Demetrius said, working with the leadership, they really truly recognize that, part of their goal and working with student athletes was really to help them be leaders beyond their time on campus. And so, they realized that it wasn't just something that they needed in terms of any specific incident. So, as I mentioned, that they had been dealing with things in their state, there had also been some incidents within the athletic department. On one team, there had been a student where one student athlete had leveled a racial slur against another student athlete. There was an issue with a sexual assault that happened that had really kind of torn apart the athletic community and really challenged them. And so in going through this program, it also provided that opportunity for them to, really realize that it's beyond the incident, but this cultural competence was really necessary as a life skill, truly. And it was really part of the values and goals of the institution, and something that they really wanted from an athletic standpoint to make sure that they were providing their students. And so I really felt that was important and impactful as well. And then equipping the students to engage in critical conversations. So, in talking with Jesse, who was one of the staff members, one of the things that was really, they'd had a big discussion with the team was about, with one of the sports that some of the team members had decided to kneel during the national anthem. And it really was tough for that team. And so the team had a team meeting about it. And, there are people on both sides of the issue, just like in society, as we've seen. And so, and also about, utilizing the example of Missouri, really taking a look at that and using that as a teaching moment for student athletes to help them examine, how are you using your platform? And so I think one of the major goals was, in all of these discussions, how are we equipping the students to engage in critical conversation? And so one thing that emerged from the study was that this program really did help them, equip them to engage in these conversations. Like I mentioned, that perspective taking, that empathy, and just really the ability to have constructive conversations. You may not agree, and that's not always the goal, but it's more about understanding and being able to see different perspectives, and how can you still move the conversation forward. And so that was something that, I know going into the program, that was something that the GCU really wanted as an outcome for the student athletes. And I feel like it emerged in the study that indeed this was something that did happen. And another finding, kind of independent from the research questions, but I really felt was a really important aspect of this, was really just building community. So I know in working with student athletes and my own personal experiences and talking with the student athletes here, there was often, there's often community within your team, but, oftentimes there's not as many opportunities for student athletes to engage with student athletes on other teams. It kind of depends sometimes on facilities or, if there's a dining hall, every, institution is different. But I feel like consistently this is something that often comes up. I know I've had this discussion with our student athletes as well, particularly over the past 2 years as we've dealt with COVID and not being able to do as much in person. But in this study, JR brought it to light, and it was also echoed by several of the other student athletes that, through this program, they really had the opportunity to talk to people from different sports and hear their story and really just talk with them. So I think they really appreciated the opportunity to build broader community, beyond the community that they had already established within their own team. So that was actually something that I feel like a number of the students talked about, and that was really for them, it was sort of something that was unexpected, but it was a really unexpected joy because they really liked that opportunity and felt like it really strengthened the athletic community as a whole. So the implications of the study. So, take the lead at GCU is really demonstrative of the ways that, how environmental conditions and organizational characteristics really shape the opportunities for student athletes to engage around social justice issues. So simply put, context matters. And that really emerged here in this study, so it's the political climate, it's the values of, the institutional values for diversity and inclusion, things that are happening, in that moment, in that context. And so this study really, demonstrated that is truly important. And then engaging around social justice issues, it does provide these valuable learning outcomes that we talked about, the self-reflection, the skill development, the cultural competency, and the critical conversations. This case study really showed that engaging around these issues did help athletes to develop this. And then those theoretical connections. So, I talked about the Melton model. And so I felt like, you could really see the connections, between that. So, for example, I mentioned the perspective taking. That was one of the roles in the Melton model, or one of the antecedents in the micro level. So, and then the outcomes, being in this program, it enabled them to have those perspectives. So it influenced a lot of the outcomes mentioned in the model, whether it was social change or awareness of social injustice, recognition of social privilege. So those are all those outcomes that align with. And then, as I mentioned, the campus connections too. You really got to see that environmental press, how what was happening in the campus community and at large was really impacting the student athletes and really impacted the ability for this program, to take shape. And then just those insights into the student athlete experience, it's one of the reasons I really love what I do. We say it all the time, this is about our students and we're here for them. And so anytime you have the opportunity to engage with student athletes, you really have that chance to learn more about their experiences. And so I felt like there were a lot of insights gained from this project as well about their experiences, their desires for engaging around social justice issues and their passion for it. And then also an important implication was the need for cultural competence of athletic staff and coaches. That was something that came up. It didn't emerge as a theme, but it was definitely present in our conversations. And, again, feeling like in order for Take the Lead to be successful, it was important that, the staff and the coaches were bought in. And part of that was having, cultural competence and understanding about why, it was important to discuss these social justice issues. And so that was a really key component as well. So the recommendations were that athletic administrators and student athletes, support staff, to really leverage the current climate of increased student activism and create opportunities for student athletes to explore these topics. We talk about this a lot, but all of our students, including our student athletes, are total people. And so this really provides an opportunity for them to, explore topics, beyond the athletic realm and different parts of their identity. And just, again, in student athlete support service staff, or you should really just be cognizant of how the unique environmental conditions and organizational characteristics at their institution, when they're looking to create these opportunities to engage student athletes around social justice issues. So, in order to create something that's going to be successful and impactful, it's important to be conscious of this. And then really creating opportunities, like I mentioned, for them to engage beyond the athletic arena is so important to the development of the student athlete. And then helping them, student athletes, to gain a greater understanding of the power of their athletic platform and the ways that sport and society, that intersection can be utilized to affect meaningful societal change. And then athletic department staff and student affairs practitioners should seek opportunities for collaboration to achieve this mutual goal. That was one thing that, came up in the conversation as well. And something that I've also seen from my own experiences is that power of that collaboration and, not only leveraging the resources that, our academic institutions have, but also just making those connections. It's so valuable for student athletes to be able to connect with their peers and, just providing other opportunities for learning. And also providing those professional development opportunities for staff and coaches to help them increase their level of cultural competence is really important. Now, and then future areas of research. So continuing to research, there's a very narrow scope of literature that truly talks about engaging student athletes around social justice issues, looking at other ways to apply the Melton model, additional ways that student affairs practitioners can support student athletes, continuing about, finding strategies for increasing cultural competence among athletic staff and coaches, and then effective strategies for engaging white students in discussions about diversity, inclusion, and racial justice. One thing that in talking with the staff, and the director of the department was a white man, and he mentioned how when they were conceptualizing this project, it was discussing, should we call this a social justice education program? Should we call it? And so they ultimately went with take the lead, and really feeling like this is part of leadership, but also recognizing that sometimes that terminology matters. And so really wanting to create a space where it wasn't going to be a turnoff, and frankly feeling that some of their white student athletes may not be comfortable in some of these spaces. So really going about making sure that keeping that in mind in regard to the program. And I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the present day. So as I mentioned, this study took place in 2016, 2017, but there's a lot that has shifted in our current climate. So from a political standpoint, with the COVID-19 pandemic and the increased social unrest, including the murder of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor last summer, that has really truly changed the game again around how we can engage student athletes around social justice issues. And so I think this has really presented an opportunity, which many institutions have leaned into in ways that are very different than before. So I think, now being in this present moment and looking at the study that, was only 3 years or 4 years old, really understanding like even some of these implications, what that means now as we continue to lean in at this current moment in this current climate. And then just the changing landscape of college athletics. So I talked a lot about, the Power Five and the conference realignment. Those things are still happening. The name, image, and likeness. Student athletes have opportunities unlike ever before to utilize their image for their own financial gain. The Alston verdict. So having the opportunity institutions have to provide educational benefits for student athletes. So this changing landscape of college athletics has also presented other unique opportunities to really engage student athletes around social justice issues in different ways. And then also in this shifting landscape, DEI practitioners in college athletics, such as myself. So in thinking about Game Changer University, I know they're one of several institutions across the country where they have a person in a role like mine where they're truly spearheading these efforts, and both from a larger context with student athletes, with coaches, with staff. And so this landscape has also provided more opportunities than ever to really engage with student athletes around these topics, and to have, seasoned professionals who are dedicated to this and they're staying current on literature and, what's happening in the moment and things of that nature to really help provide some expertise and guidance to athletic departments, unlike ever before. Obviously, we've had diversity practitioners for a long time, both in the higher ed setting and others, but I think in this unique moment, given this current climate, there's definitely having formalized roles for people in athletics to help provide this guidance really presents a very, very unique opportunity at this current time. So I know we will move into the Q&A period. I've seen the chat and some things coming up in the Q&A session. I'll pass it back to Dr. Arungu, but I did want to just leave up my contact information. If you have any questions that we don't have the opportunity to address, or you want to learn more about the study or things that I've learned throughout, engage in this work, please feel free to reach out. And that's also my Twitter handle. I'm fairly active there, but email is probably the best way to reach me. Dr. Arungu?
Thank you so much, Dr. Gay, for such an insightful presentation and the study that's really very unique. So thank you so much for accepting our invitation. I know there was somebody who had asked whether this is published so that they can share with their colleagues.
Yes, so it is not, it hasn't been published in terms of academic journal, but it is available. I did make the dissertation available through, most campus libraries. So it is available in that way. But, also we talk about the current moment has really pushed me to want to be engaged from a research perspective and, continue to, as I mentioned, those were, there's so much opportunity, not only from a practitioner standpoint, but from a research standpoint. And so I'm really looking forward to potentially publishing from this work, as well as conducting additional research.
Yeah, and I see that Charmaine is reminding us, we do have an NCORE journal where you could publish. So if you could connect with us, that would be wonderful.
Absolutely, I would love to do that. I appreciate that.
So there are a couple of questions here, and I also have a few questions that I would like to ask, but I see Charmaine is asking, did GCU and or the LEAD program provide information and support related to empowering student athletes to engage in systemic change? From the presentation, it seems like the skill development related to personal awareness and interpersonal dialogue conversations level. Were there opportunities to teach students how organizations work and how to be successful and strategic if change was needed at the system level?
Yeah, so I would say that didn't emerge from the research, but part of that I think is because, with the program was so new, and I think they really started with thinking through the interpersonal standpoint, but I feel like the vision for the program, and I've seen how it's grown, and so I would say in its current state now, I think there are more opportunities to talk about that. But I think, from the standpoint when I was doing the project, the students had been through some of those more personal and interpersonal aspects of the curriculum.
Mm-hmm.
But I definitely feel like that they now have had the opportunity to have bigger picture discussions.
And somebody is asking, how did the GCU staff or director keep in mind how comfortable students of color were with programming? It was referenced that the nomenclature and the programming was set up being mindful of white students' comfort.
Yes.
How do you delineate between being intentionally inclusive and whitewashing content to make individuals comfortable?
So I think, when the director and I had that conversation, I too wrestled with this, being someone working in D&I, being a woman of color. I definitely was something that I wrestled with. And I think from their standpoint, just candidly, I felt that they wanted to make sure that this wasn't a barrier for engagement. And so it was more so like, let's figure out how we can get the most people. We don't want to turn anyone off. And so I do agree with the question of like, hey, why were, is it about comfort? But I think for them, they felt like if we can get people through the door, if we can get everybody to buy in, we're going to have some real conversations. And they did. So, I think that the content was not, watered down, but I think that they felt it was important that, the programming name of itself, they wanted to make sure that they were able to attract the largest, because this wasn't a mandatory program. That was the other thing. And so I think they wanted to make sure that they were able to attract the widest group of student athletes possible and to make sure that they could get full engagement. But I do think that's a great question. And it was something that actually we discussed it. I really thought a lot about it in my writing and thinking about the program, and the staff had a very honest discussion about that as well. And some of the student athletes, because the student athletes were engaged in the launch of the program. And so I'm glad that this question was asked. This actually did come up, and I felt like, it gave me pause as well initially, but I feel like, in talking more about it, I felt a little better in the sense that it was discussed and it was something they were cognizant of. But really, the spirit of that decision of the naming of it was, we want to frame this in a way that it gets everybody to the table. And once we get to that, we can't have the real conversations we need to have if we don't have everybody at the table. And so I think that's why they chose to take that route.
Right. One of the things you say is an implication here, and something for us, everybody to think about, is that athletics associations or departments need to have DEI staff on board. But we know that many schools don't have DEI staff, not just athletics, but even some institutions don't have that role. Can you talk a little bit more of why this is important and some specific topics or focus that you would recommend for DEI staff, for athletic staff?
Yeah, so I think this is hugely important. As we know, diversity, equity, inclusion work is an all hands on deck process. And I think it's important to have somebody who can lead that effort for your institution and for your athletic department. But I think it's also important that, that the work is, everybody's engaged in the work. And so I know that different schools have different models, but I do think, having that person to really lead the effort, make sure that there's a strategic plan in place and that it's actualized is really important. Really thinking about the different audiences, how are we leaning into this, as an organization? So for example, in my role, we've talked about a myriad of things, from supplier diversity to what are our recruitment and retention strategies? What are, education is a big thing of what we do in my current institution. We have monthly community conversations about different things. We bring in speakers where we have quarterly conversations with our leadership groups, both from a head coach standpoint and our executive and senior staff. So making sure that this is, I think, having that person in the role. Obviously this work can be done and it can look differently in a lot of places, but I think having that person who is leading that effort, make sure that it's really integrated in all aspects of your organization. And so I think that it's really critical. And I think that's why we've seen more of these roles, come to be, especially over the last year and a half in athletics, because I think there's, a greater understanding, given everything that transpired last year, that, this is really, really important. And, I've heard this a lot about, this is a movement and not a moment. So how do we continue to sustain the movement and transcend the moment and make sure that this work is continuing? And so I think having that person who's able to spearhead that, I rely a lot on partnerships and collaborations across campus. So having somebody who's available to do that, I think is really important as well.
You also mentioned about perspective taking and empathy. Can you talk a little bit more about perspective taking? What is it you are expecting from staff, and how will the student athletes benefit from this?
So I think it's something, not just for student athletes, but everybody, I think is just really having the opportunity to be exposed to learn somebody else's story, learn, what they've been through, what's important to them, their values, their background, all that I think is really important. And it really provides an opportunity to think about things from a different way, to come outside of your own experience. And I think, in having some of these, discussions, it was really, I think back to, last summer and some of the conversations that we had internally about race. I mean, there's a lot of things that some people hadn't thought about before. We've talked about that in regards to other aspects of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I think creating those space and opportunity for people to really, hear someone else's story, here's something different that they haven't heard before, and really to consider things from a different way. Because I think a lot of times that's the key to advancing DEI work and social justice, is really, helping people understand the experience of others and, why this matters.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that that's really important. And I think the empathy part that ties into it. So when you can understand what someone is experiencing,
Mm-hmm.
you have more compassion and you're more motivated to affect change. But I think sometimes if something isn't part of your experience, it's maybe not on your radar of something that needs to be addressed. And so I think oftentimes it's about that exposure. It's about, highlighting issues that are taking place and really connecting with people, hearing their stories that can really help motivate us to collective change, because it really is a collective effort.
So in looking at the changing landscape, especially in D1 athletics, there's a lot that has changed. And you did mention about aligning the values of the athletic departments with the values of the institution. But what about individual values? Some students want to come in and they want to, make some money because now that pathway has opened. So how do you bring all this together? Of course, remembering that these are student athletes, that the goal here is to go to school and be successful, but also there is a goal of making some money.
Yeah, so I think when I think about that question, inclusion really comes to mind. So, I think everybody would agree it's tough to create a space that's perfectly inclusive, but I think doing your best to create a space to be as inclusive as possible for the different interests of student athletes. So to your point, if that's a focus, or, education is a focus for everybody, but, really just creating an environment where student athletes have the opportunity to explore all of those different needs and all their different perspectives, and really have the opportunity to really achieve that. In this name, image, and likeness landscape, student athletes, some have looked at it as an opportunity to make money. Others have utilized their, awareness for charitable endeavors. And, it's everybody has the right to their own, reasons for what they want to do, and there's space for all of it. And so really, I think for us is helping, student athletes to be able to explore all of that, whatever their reasons may be. And so I think for us as administrators, it's really finding a way, if a student athlete, if the financial piece is important, how do we support them in that? If it's both, if it's community engagement, how do we support them in that? If it's all of the above, how do we support them in that? So I think for us, it's number one, continuing to be in touch with the needs of our student athletes. And secondly, I think it's, doing our best to make sure that we have resources in place to support them in all their endeavors.
Exactly, supporting them, building that community, making sure they're successful, but also not isolating them, making sure that they are engaging outside athletics.
Absolutely.
I want to thank you so very much for presenting this. This was very insightful, and you had a great audience as well. So
Thank you. I appreciate everybody being here today. It was
joined us.
enjoyable.
I want to say that the presentation is going to be available on our website in 4 to 5 days. So if you have folks who missed the presentation, they can always access it from our website. If you have any questions for Dr. Gay, you can always write to her. Can you repeat your email?
Yes, so it's cgay@uga.edu.
If you go to the University of Georgia website, I'm sure you'll find her there. And on Twitter,
Yes,
and on Twitter as
absolutely.
well. So please drop a thank you note for Dr. Gay. This was very, very good. I'm very, very grateful for you coming.
Thank you. I appreciate the invitation and I appreciate everybody's engagement today.
Thank you so much. And on behalf of the University of Oklahoma, University Outreach, and the ENCO organization, Southwest Center for Human Relations Studies, I want to thank everybody, and I hope to see you very soon. Thank you so much, everybody.